Hello, and thank you for joining me for Samuel in Springtime. Today is Friday, May 14th, and we'll be looking at 1 Samuel chapter 14. In chapter 14, we expect calamity to befall Israel based on how we were left in chapter 13. Saw doing wrong in the sight of the Lord. He made a hasty sacrifice. Samuel came and said, no, this isn't good. However, it is Jonathan, Saul's son, that is actually triumphant. And it's interesting from a military intelligence angle what Jonathan does. He's clever. And he routs another Philistine garrison by coming in the cracks at the entrance and exit to where they are gathered. And what happens is he and his armor bearer trust in God and they go in there to fight the Philistines. And as they rout the Philistines, like 20 men apiece, these two guys, the people who are hiding in the cut, they're hiding in the cracks and in the caves, they hear that Israel is successful and come out and join the fight. And so everything increases and goes well. And there's lots of detail about that. But then it says that some of the Philistines join in with Jonathan and his armor bearer. And it just gets a little muddled because over to the east of them, Saul is with his people and kind of is aware of this melee going on and comes in to assist. But then the scripture tells us that people are just, it's chaos. They're just fighting each other. And they should have just left well enough alone. Saul is kind of the image that you get from that. And so in order to succeed in battle, Saul comes up with an idea. He makes this oath. And he says, "Cursed be any man who eats on this day until the day is done. We won't eat today. We will, fast, basically." They don't use the word fast. They said, it's an oath. And they won't eat in order to win the battle. Well, because Jonathan is somewhere else, he doesn't hear the message about not eating. And there's honeycombs and honey all over the ground. And Jonathan takes some honey and he eats the honey. And they're all very careful not to eat the honey, but Jonathan does it because he doesn't know about the oath. And then they explain that to him. And he said, "Well, I didn't know about it, and look at me." The scripture says he's brightened, and what that really means is he's been restored. Like he eats some of the honey, and it makes him, the sugar probably, makes him feel better, and he's restored. He can fight some more. For some reason, Saul's oath, I don't know what it has to do with, it's not a good idea because they're all very hungry and they're suffering. And if they could just eat, and this is what Jonathan says to him, "You could just eat something, you'd feel better. Look at me, I ate something, I feel better." Well, anyway, they win the day and they end up eating the spoils. But what happens is they eat the animals and the blood. And that's a no-no. The blood with the animals is reserved only for the deity, and they do it anyway. I mean, maybe they're frenzy because they won in insurmountable odds against the Philistines. Anyway, the army that's hungry eats the animals and the blood, and they do what is not right in the sight of the Lord, and so they are in trouble. So Saul gets a large stone, and you're probably reading this going, what is the stone about? The large stone is for draining the blood for the animals. They just didn't have the stone, and they were just eating it. So the large stone, he has it rolled in. They start to, then they take some oxen. They start to do it properly, and they start to eat properly. So that's what that story is about. And I don't know what the significance of that is. It's just, that's their dietary laws, and they couldn't follow them because they had the stone. They bring the stone, and they can follow them. So that's kind of where that goes to. Then Saul finds out that Jonathan ate the honey. And he says that Jonathan has to be put to death because he ate the honey. He ate when there was an oath going on. And the people intercede on Jonathan's behalf and ransom him from his father, because in all the battles and all the things that they've done, the only successful kind of general they have is Jonathan. He's taken these at least 2 garrisons of Philistines and led them in battle successfully because of his knowledge and his faithfulness, and maybe he is a man after God's own heart because he's been so successful in battle. So the people advocate for him, and to me, that's the end of the story. That it sort of encapsulates this whole tale of Jonathan and Saul, and how Jonathan sort of surpasses his father as a leader, as a military leader, and a fighter and a warrior. And he's right about eating. Like, everyone should have eaten. You can't put me to death for that, because I did eat. So, but that's not where the chapter ends. So there's this little tag on the end, and what it appears to be is apparently the narrator changed. I don't know where this came from, but it's inserted. It's definitely inserted in here, and it feels a lot like what the priestly voice in Genesis would sound like, because it's very lineal and about the lineage, and it's about like, this is the son of so and so, and this is the father of so and so. So, and then what I'm talking about is chapter verse 47, and that's where it begins. Verse 47 to 52. It's a long chapter, 14. Verse 47 to 52. It sort of seems like that it was the end of this conflict with the Philistines, and everything's resolved with Jonathan. And then we get this idea of Saul taken the kingship over Israel. He fought against his enemies on every side. So we get Moab, we get Ammonites, we get Edom, we get the kings of Zobah, and the Philistines are last. And the narrator only says that Saul was he fought valiantly, and that he was victorious and struck down the Amalekites and rescued Israel out of the hands of those who plundered them. So it's a very few verses of celebrating Saul. And then it says, now the sons of Saul were Jonathan. Oh, this is not the first time we've heard about Jonathan, but it's the first time we hear, shouldn't this go earlier somewhere? I don't know. Ishvi, and there's other sons there's other sons. And he had 2 daughters, and one of those daughters' names is Michael, and she will become important later. And Saul's wife is named here, so it's basically like the priestly voice in Genesis, where it names who and whom and who belongs to who. And then after the naming is done, and there's like the nephew and who was the commander of the guard and how he was related to Saul as well. But there was hard fighting against the Philistines all the days of Saul. And when Saul saw any strong or valiant warrior, he took him into his service. Like, he's identified as this great king of Israel in this little passage here. So good, It doesn't really contradict what you see before, but it just leaves out a lot, because the battles that were won by Jonathan would be counted as Saul's win because it's the same side. However, it's not the whole story of what happened with Saul and Israel. So, it's interesting for us to see Saul the way we should see him. And he's a complicated figure. He is successful in some regard. And if you I know there's a thing where should the sins of the father be commuted to the son, inherited sins, that's kind of a theme in scripture. But does it work the other way around? If the son, if it's good things and positive things, the father can give those to the son, but can the son give those to the father? And this is what we have here. We have Jonathan, this beloved, this wonderful son of Saul, doing good things. Now, this is an opposition, if we think about it, to what we've seen of sons in the past, right? If you look at Eli, his 2 sons, no good. They looked for Samuel. Samuel's 2 sons, no good. They needed to have Saul. And so this patrilineal system is interrupted by, I guess, corruption and the people being like, no, this is not so good. And here we have the opposite taking place. We have the king being the king and having done some good things for Israel, but then his son being the more benevolent and successful figure, which, I think is interesting. And it sets the stage to me, in my own literary mind, for the David and Solomon relationship, because of course David, no one would surpass him as God's beloved, the greatest king of Israel. And he's coming. We're not talking about him yet. And then his son Solomon is also a great king who, in his own right, has wisdom and creates the temple. And there's things good about that. And then there are patrilineal kings after that. But after Solomon, the kingdom is divided, and there's 2 separate kingdoms and 2 sets of kings. So anyway, just that's kind of where I feel like this first book of 1st and 2nd Samuel is interesting, because of the political and sort of military conquests and shifts in how the people are perceived as politics, right? The people perceive them. And so the people are behind Jonathan, save his life, and then the narrator changes, and it's somebody who has a different perspective than the majority of the writer of Samuel, who's saying having a king is not so good. But Saul is shined up and set out for glory in this chapter 14 at the very end. So verse 47 through 52 is the shiny, glossy version of Saul's reign as king of Israel. See you tomorrow for the 15th chapter.